Good day and welcome to this video blog. Today's video blog is a question and answer period. These are questions that we didn't get to from our webinar on controlled temperature chambers, qualification, mapping, and monitoring. If you didn't get to see that webinar, you can watch the recording. The link is below the video. But today we welcome back Vaisala Senior GXP Regulatory Compliance Expert, Paul Daniel, and Nathan Roman, the Validation Director at Genesis AEC. And they're here again to answer the questions that we didn't have time to answer during the webinar. So let's skip the intros and roll right into the questions. Does that sound good to you, Nathan and Paul?
Sounds good.
All right. And quickly, thank you to everyone who sent questions, and we're going to make good on our promise to get back on all of them. So the first question, how do you determine number of sensors and how long to map a controlled temperature chamber during a validation? Paul, do you want to tackle that first and then go to Nathan?
Yeah, this is definitely the top questions that get asked. How many sensors and how long to map for? For numbers of sensors and where to position them, you can simply refer to the ISP Good Practice Guide on controlled temperature chambers that we covered in the webinar. It'll tell you use 9 sensors for CTCs that are smaller than 2 cubic meters, and use 15 sensors for CTCs between 2 and 20 cubic meters. And they'll even give you some proposed layouts. When you get into larger areas, cold rooms, warehouses, you're going to need to develop a scientific rationale for your sensor placement. And again, you can refer to that ISPE guide for some guidance on that. Now, duration of mapping, that's another animal completely. You don't see many recommendations in the guide. Personally, I've always aimed for 72-hour mappings for smaller chambers and rooms, and I aim for 1 week for larger rooms and warehouses. The longer the mapping, you get more data, you get more confidence, that chamber or area can maintain the required uniformity, and that's usually going to be enough to satisfy any auditor. What do you think, Nate?
So I agree. I agree with you. The typical controlled temperature chamber that we do studies on a regular basis, the sensors would be placed in the 8 corners of the unit, with one in the geometric in the center of the space. So that is a minimum of 9. And then you don't want to forget about the additional sensor that might be placed by your RTD or even your BMS probe, your BAS probe. And so that would be a typical or a good configuration for most fridges, freezers, incubators. And that layout is, of course, dependent on the size of the unit that you're mapping. For example, the counter height units or an upright unit or a double door. But like Paul said, for larger units, you would place, maybe 5 sensors on the middle shelf, or there's even alternate patterns on the shelves that you can do. I have an example that I'd be happy to provide if that's something that you're looking for. But as far as duration, it's my experience that CTCs are temperature mapped for 24 hours. Walk-in cold rooms are 72 hours, and the warehouses are about 7 days consecutive.
Okay, excellent. So next question. Is there any requirement / limit for door open recovery tests and power fail tests? And Nathan, why don't you take this first?
Okay, so there's no regulatory requirement for those tests. However, there is guidance that speaks to performing the testing, such as the USP 1079, the good storage and distribution practices for drug products. I do have that quote available, and I'll read that real quick for you guys. It says that temperature mapping should account for maximum and minimum loads to capture temperature variability resulting from variations in temperature, mass of the payload. performance of the equipment under extreme scenarios, including open door, closed door, and simulated equipment failures should be taken into account. So to answer your question, there is no requirement or limit for the open door power failure testing, but it's mentioned.
Yeah, I would even go so far to add there, Nate, that this is a USP 1000 chapter, and all the chapters over 1000 are considered guidance only, not requirements. So we shouldn't treat this as an absolute requirement that you need to do door open, door closed, or equipment failure tests. This is just guidance on how to do it.
Right. That's a good point to bring up for folks that don't quite understand that, because lots of people just they know that it's been done, but they just don't know why. So.
Okay, good. Let's go to question number 3. Would you consider the VL 1021N as a semi-buffered during temperature mapping, as the thermistor is hidden inside the logger and not fully exposed to the air? Paul, can you answer that?
Yeah, certainly. Actually have in my hand here a VL 2000, really similar to the device the question asker was asking about. And I appreciate the distinction that they're trying to make, but no, I wouldn't consider this to be buffered. There's an internal sensor in here, but it's not hidden deep inside. It's right here at the corner. It's on the PCB right next to these generous vents to let air flow through the housing, right? Allowing it to measure air temperature and humidity in this case. So you'll have a slightly slower response time than an sensor that's out there in the air, but we're not talking about much difference, like maybe 15 seconds. But you have to stop and think about this, because most sensors, they're protected in some way, right? So that the sensor can have a long life and it can deal with some abuse. For reference, let's think about your average RTD. It appears to be a metal cylinder about the size of a pen, but what you're actually looking at is a stainless steel housing covering the actual sensor element. So if you're going to call this semi-buffered, you have to call a normal RTD semi-buffered, because there's additional mass protecting that sensor that's going to change the reaction time. So anytime we're dealing with a protected sensor, which is just about all sensors, it's probably better just to think of reaction times and recognize that there's a really clear distinction between a protected sensor like this with a short reaction time and, taking an RTD and sticking it in a mass of some kind of media that's going to have a really slow reaction time.
Okay. All right, let's go to the next question, and then we can get 2 perspectives on that one. So how do you map a freeze dryer? Should we use the same approach that we use for chambers? Paul, you want to go first?
Sure. Absolutely don't use the same approach you use for a chamber. Chambers, these CTCs, where we've been discussing them within the context of this guide, are just being used for a static process we call storage. All we're doing in the chamber is maintaining that payload at a stable temperature for an undefined amount of time. Now, freeze drying, completely different process. You're cooling a product under a vacuum with a completely different goal. You're trying to remove moisture by freezing and sublimation. So you have a completely different set of acceptance criteria for successful drying, and they're really different than successful storage. I consider mapping a freeze dryer much more to be like mapping an autoclave or a sterilizer. It's a dynamic batch process with well-defined success criteria at the end, where CTC, the storage of something in a controlled temperature chamber, it's a static process. It doesn't have an end. So while the techniques might overlap, mapping, pre-cal, post-cal, the processes are completely different. Nate, I know you actually do some of this for a living, so why don't you add your wisdom?
No, I absolutely agree with you, Paul. A freeze dryer will not have the same qualification tests as a controlled temperature chamber, The freeze dryer operation will go through the different phases, the temperature changes and the vacuum and the pulling the vacuum. Like you said, it's much like the sterilizer that you gave an example of. But the freeze dryers are validated or qualified to ensure functionality according to ISO 13408-3, and a few example tests in a freeze dryer validation would consist of mapping the freeze dryer shelf temperatures with no load, with a load, performing an SIP if applicable, and pulling vacuum tests.
Yeah, that's a lot different, a much bigger scope than just
Right.
mapping a chamber.
Okay, so let's call it there for this video blog. We're going to answer the questions in 3 different blogs. So we'll call this part 1. And please join us for part 2 and part 3, which will follow about a week or 2 apart throughout the summer. And yeah, we sent out the recording, but if you didn't get a chance to watch it, you can watch it now. We also have a document where Nathan and Paul got together and answered every single question. So if you missed that document by email, you can just email myself or Paul, and we're happy to send that to you. So thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Paul, and we'll see you all again soon.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Thank you.